Senua's Saga Hellblade II is easily one of the most visually stunning and technically ambitious games I have ever played. This underpins a dark and compelling story which, whilst not as groundbreaking as the first game, fits in with the tone and themes of the original Hellblade whilst adding new dimensions that will keep you hooked. The only thing not so unambiguously positive is the gameplay. The level and puzzle design is extremely effective, if on occasion overstaying its welcome, whilst the combat has an extremely realistic weight to it, but this has a lot of potential to exhaust players rather than keep them playing. Before diving into the weeds of it, we should probably talk about the notion of games as experiences, and what that means here. For at least some players, cinematic story-driven games such as The Last of Us or God of War, and others, primarily from Sony's catalogue, are only one step removed from being movies, or mere walking simulators. That criticism is in many cases far from the reality, with many story-driven games still having deep gameplay systems for both replay value and for taking on tough gameplay challenges. With Hellblade, and this applies to the original game as much as the sequel, there's more weight to the notion. A much greater percentage of the game's shorter runtime is spent in forced walking segments, and the gameplay isn't just driven by the story, but actively feels secondary to it. Hellblade 2 took me about 6 hours to beat, and I'm not sure that more than half of that was spent fighting enemies or solving puzzles. This doesn't have to be a bad thing, and I'll say right off the bat that the gameplay's limitations both in quantity and quality didn't stop me from enjoying the experience overall. But I mention it because this has from Hellblade 2's launch been a big part of the discourse, and it will influence whether people choose to play it. For me, the short runtime isn't an issue, because I don't think that the value of a game should be calculated on a per hour basis. For the story that the game is trying to tell, a longer runtime would feel dragged out rather than adding value, not least because it's already an extremely slow-paced game and story. As for the gameplay to cinematics balance, I'm certainly not advocating for every game to apply the ratio that Hellblade does. But at the same time, for this specific experience, it's a story I enjoyed the telling of. And even if it's not a game I'm itching to replay again immediately, I'm glad that I played it rather than skipped it, and I'm sure I'll want to dive into it again in the future after enough time has passed. With all of that said, let's actually talk about the specifics of the game. The most obvious starting place is the presentation, and this is a stunning looking game. Visual fidelity in games is surely plateauing this generation, yet Hellblade 2 manages to stand tall even next to other incredibly realistic looking games of recent years. But far more important than graphical realism is art direction, and here too the game excels. The use of colour and lighting to convey the way in which the world of the story shifts, the weight of the emotional beats, and the otherworldliness of the mythological elements is superb. Combined with fantastic performances, particularly that of Melina Jurgens, but also the supporting cast, which are elevated by the fidelity of the characters, and a soundtrack which evokes epic fantastical sagas, dark suffocating horror, and deep cutting emotions with equal expertise. This is a world that you cannot help but be immersed in. The narrative picks up where Hellblade 1 left off, with Senua having battled her personal demons through the Norse hell and come out the other side, and sees her willingly taken as a slave on a ship bound for Iceland, where she hopes to free her people who have been enslaved. The game opens with the slave ship being sunk off the coast, and an intense struggle to survive first the elements and then the surviving slavers. She takes the slave master Thorgester captive to lead her to his settlement of Borgoviki. On the way, she will gather more companions to aid her journey, as well as taking on cannibalistic undead Draugr and the giants that torment the land. As with the original game, the historical and mythological trappings of the story frame a much more human drama rooted in mental health and illness, loss, trauma, guilt, and how people relate to one another. Where the first game was centered upon Senua's struggle with her own psychosis, in the second game we explore how she relates to other people, both in being able to talk about her own condition and how people perceive her, but also in taking on the weight of other people's problems and how those struggling with their mental health relate to one another. The original game, of course, broke far more ground, being the first time that these subjects have been addressed in this specific way. but Hellblade 2 continues in that tradition, with the depictions rooted in consultation with clinical experts and those experiencing the disorder to ensure its authenticity. And it's important to note that in the sequel, Senua hasn't overcome her condition or been cured, but has learned to manage it and is learning to accept it, with personal acceptance and refusal to be defined by her past abuse an important part of her arc. And all of this feeds into the narrative in an organic, natural way that never feels heavy-handed nor immersion-breaking when it comes to the historical and mythological elements. Moving to how the gameplay fits into this, the puzzles are once again tied to the mythological aspects, and particularly the power of runes and altering reality by viewing it from different perspectives. If you've played the first game, then these puzzles will be familiar, but there is variation as you go from having to identify runes in the shapes in the world, to viewing the world mirrored upon itself, and using that to open and close different paths in order to find your way to your objective, and then ultimately joining these two elements together in altering the shape of the world to create paths to the runes you need. The puzzles reflect perhaps the best of the level design in the game, with what seem like linear paths opening up to some exploration and forcing you to think in different perspectives in order to reach objectives. However, there are points where they also highlight the forced linearity of other aspects of the levels, particularly the forced walking areas. There are plenty of places where you can only go in one direction because veering off the path pushes you against an invisible wall. This isn't so bad where the wall is a high cliff or a ruin, and even the typical level design motifs of tight squeezes to load in the next area aren't anything to complain about. But when the barrier is just slightly rockier terrain, it feels more forced, and for a moment at least, the beauty of the landscape feels more artificial, and as though the game is just guiding you and you're little more than a passenger. This is also true in some of the more scripted cinematic sequences, where you're frantically escaping from environmental danger. One example early on is the slow and arduous progress through shipwrecks and waves, where the only time you feel that you have any control is if you stop pushing up on the left stick, and Senua stops, or even then only after several seconds delay. The seamless switch from cutscene to gameplay, and the lack of any HUD elements for the benefit of immersion, ironically exacerbates this feeling of not being in control at times, especially with the input delay. As I said earlier, this isn't a deal breaker on the experience as a whole, but it is worth noting as it is jarring and also not something I've experienced with other games where there are seamless transitions, due to the gameplay being more obvious as gameplay, whilst Hellblade 2 wants you to play, but is also very set on taking you through a guided tour. The clash between the freedom gameplay should represent and the intent of a more on-rails experience comes to a head in the combat. The combat in Hellblade 1 wasn't particularly deep, and in some cases, particularly shield enemies, approached frustrating. But on the whole, the systems worked as intended, and it didn't take too long to get the hang of parrying or dodging and then using light and heavy attacks to take your opponent down, with your focus ability often giving you the upper hand as it slowed the enemy down. Those same systems are in play in the sequel, and yet they don't feel the same at all. The influence for the combat in Hellblade 2 is the Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones, and Ninja Theory recorded a wide variety of battle animations whilst working to make the combat feel urgent and unpredictable. It certainly is that, and a lot heavier than the first game, but seemingly at the expense of the combat systems working as expected. Dodging and parrying are both less effective than they were before. Senua's dodge often little more than a scrambling stumble, the parry often stunning her so that you have a second or two before you can make another move. If you get attacks in fast, you can often break the enemy's guard fast, and once you pierce flesh, the fight is over quickly. But if you don't manage that, then it can feel like an exhausting slog. Whether an enemy's certain attack is more effectively parried or dodged doesn't appear consistent, and hits can feel like they come out of nowhere. This might be more realistic in a sense, but it's more frustrating than immersive. Rather than a system to master, combat felt like a chore to get past in order to continue enjoying the rest of the story. And what moments of fun there were to be had when it felt as though you were in a rhythm were drowned out by the rest being a frustrating, inconsistent grind. One particular instance where I was utterly fed up with the combat was the final boss fight. which is a shame as it came close to undercutting what was otherwise a really effective and powerful conclusion to the story. It didn't, thankfully, and I could appreciate the narrative for what it was. But that fight was a culmination of all the faults of unresponsive controls, inconsistent responses to my parries or dodges, and just plain cheapness that I had to grit my teeth through. Had the game simply kept the combat functioning as it had in the first game, I wouldn't have thought that this broke immersion or realism. Instead, I might have enjoyed it more. The only effect of more realistic combat was feeling that I really didn't want to do this, as it was a chore I just had to get through with gritted teeth. One thing to note is that, although I didn't use it, there is an accessibility option in the settings for the offensive and or defensive actions to play themselves out, without input from the player, as well as a simplified mode where, as long as you choose an offensive or defensive action, the game will act out the most appropriate one for the context. These options will of course benefit those with physical or motor function disabilities that may prohibit a lot of quick button inputs, but may also serve as a way to switch off the grind, in the same way that the auto QTE option in Callisto Protocol saved a lot of time from cheap button mash events. The game also has accessibility options for colour blindness, subtitle customization and audio mixing, which are welcome given that the visual and audio presentation of the game, whilst gorgeous, is inherently going to be inaccessible to some people for sensory as well as impairment reasons. Along with the ability to fully remap the controls, and the option to remove licensed music in streamer mode, there's just about all the customization you could want from the game, whether for accessibility or for sheer convenience. And although I've spent a fair amount of time in this video highlighting my frustrations with certain aspects of the game, I do want to emphasise that on the whole I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I made the choice to play it. The specific things I've highlighted will be a deal breaker for some players, which is fine, but this is ironically where its short runtime works in its favour. Whatever its flaws in gameplay, this is a visually and technically stunning experience, which tells a well-paced, powerful and captivating story that feels authentic in its portrayal of history, mythology and mental illness alike. Have you played Hellblade 2 yet? If not, what's making you want to pick it up, or to avoid it? If you have, did you have the same or a different experience with it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. Like the video that just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. This is a Patreon and member supported channel, so if you want to become a member and unlock custom badges and emojis, early access to my videos, and your name in the credits, then click the join button below. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.